Keanu Reeves had always loved late-night rides. The roar of his Norton Commando 961 echoed through the quiet streets of Los Angeles, the city lights flickering like distant stars. Tonight, as he rode past dimly lit storefronts and empty sidewalks, his mind wandered. It had been a long evening, another fundraiser, another speech, another night of shaking hands and smiling for the cameras. The event had been for arts education in public schools, a cause close to his heart. But as much as he believed in the mission, the pressure of fame weighed on him. That's why these rides were so important. A way to escape, even for a little while. But then, something made him slow down. To his right, slumped against the brick wall of a shuttered shop, was a lone figure wrapped in a tattered blanket. Keanu had seen homelessness before, too often. It was an unfortunate reality in this city, a reality that never got easier to accept. But this time, something felt different. Maybe it was the way the figure sat, too still, too withdrawn. Maybe it was just instinct, or maybe it was something else. Keanu's grip tightened on the handlebars. He told himself to keep going, but his heart was already telling him to turn back. With a deep breath, he made his decision. He slowed his bike, turned around, and pulled up near the sidewalk, the dim glow of his headlights illuminating the figure. As he got closer, his stomach tightened. There was something familiar about this person. He removed his gloves, stepping off his motorcycle, his pulse quickening for reasons he couldn't explain. And then, as the figure shifted slightly, Keanu saw her face. His breath caught in his throat. It couldn't be. Mrs. Collins. Keanu stood frozen, his heart pounding. The woman sitting on the sidewalk, wrapped in layers of worn-out fabric, her hair streaked with gray, her eyes weary with exhaustion, was someone he had never expected to see like this. Mrs. Collins, his high school theater teacher, the woman who had once stood in front of a classroom full of life and passion, guiding young actors with an encouraging voice, the woman who had taught him about Shakespeare, stage presence, and believing in himself. And now, she was here, alone, cold, homeless. Keanu swallowed hard, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. For a moment, he didn't know if she recognized him. Her gaze was distant, her posture guarded, as if expecting another stranger to walk past without stopping. But then, her tired eyes met his, and slowly, they widened. "Keanu," she whispered, as if she didn't trust her own voice. Keanu felt his chest tighten. The years had changed both of them, but he could still see the warmth in her expression, the same warmth that had once welcomed a quiet, uncertain boy onto the stage. "Mrs. Collins," he said, kneeling down beside her. His voice was steady, but inside, he was breaking. "What happened?" Mrs. Collins let out a shaky breath, her hands clutching the edges of her tattered coat. She hesitated, as if unsure whether to speak. Years of hardship had taught her that most people who asked questions didn't really want the answers. But Keanu? He was different. She could see it in his eyes, the same kindness she had known all those years ago. With a deep breath, she finally spoke. "It all happened so fast," she murmured. "One thing after another." Keanu listened intently, his brows furrowed in concern. "I retired from teaching about 10 years ago," she continued, her voice laced with exhaustion. "I thought I'd finally get some time for myself. But then," she paused, shaking her head. Keanu waited patiently, giving her the time she needed. "My husband got sick," she finally said, her voice breaking slightly. "Cancer. We spent everything on treatments, every last cent." Keanu's chest tightened. She looked down at her hands. "After he passed, I tried to keep up with the bills, but I couldn't. The savings were gone, the house, the car. I lost it all." Keanu swallowed hard, guilt creeping into his chest. How had he not known? While he had been making movies, walking red carpets, and riding motorcycles through the hills of Los Angeles, his former teacher, the woman who had helped shape him into the person he was, had been suffering. Alone, homeless, forgotten, until tonight. Keanu's jaw tightened. Not anymore. Keanu felt a lump in his throat as Mrs. Collins spoke. She had given so much to her students, had dedicated her life to inspiring others, and yet, when she needed help the most, no one had been there for her. Until now. Keanu reached out, gently placing a hand over hers. She flinched at first, not used to kindness anymore, but when she saw the genuine concern in his eyes, she relaxed. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," Keanu said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Mrs. Collins let out a soft, disbelieving chuckle. "Keanu, I've been on my own for a long time now." He shook his head. "Not anymore." She blinked, her eyes searching his face. This wasn't just pity. This was a promise. Keanu reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. "Let me get you somewhere safe for the night," he said. "Then we'll figure out the rest." Mrs. Collins hesitated, her pride and years of self-reliance battling with her exhaustion. But then she saw the look in his eyes, a look that said, "I won't walk away from you." She nodded, her body sagging with relief. And just like that, everything started to change. Keanu wasted no time. With a few quick taps on his phone, he arranged for a hotel room, a place where Mrs. Collins could sleep in a warm bed for the first time in years. But that wasn't enough. He wasn't just looking to give her one good night. He was looking to give her a new life. As they waited for the ride he had called, Mrs. Collins looked at him with a mix of gratitude and hesitation. "I don't know how to thank you for this," she said softly. Keanu shook his head. "You already did," he replied. "Years ago." She gave him a small, tired smile. "I just did what any teacher would do." Keanu's expression softened. "You did more than that," he said. "You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. You saw something in me before anyone else did." Mrs. Collins blinked, her lips pressing together. She had no idea how much of an impact she had made on him back then. And now, he was going to return the favor. The car pulled up, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Keanu helped Mrs. Collins to her feet, steadying her as she climbed inside. As he shut the door, he leaned in and said, "This is just the beginning." And Mrs. Collins, for the first time in a long time, she believed him. The next morning, everything felt different. Mrs. Collins woke up in a real bed, under the warmth of clean blankets. For a moment, she forgot where she was. This wasn't a cold sidewalk. There was no roaring street noise, no feeling of being invisible. She was safe, and all of it, because of one man. When she made her way down to the hotel lobby, Keanu was already there. Holding a cup of coffee, he greeted her with a warm smile. "Good morning." Mrs. Collins let out a shaky breath, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I still can't believe this is happening," she whispered. Keanu set his cup down. "I told you, this is just the beginning." Mrs. Collins froze. He wasn't just talking about one night in a hotel. He meant something bigger. "I found a place for you to stay," Keanu continued, "and I've spoken to some people who can help you get back on your feet." Mrs. Collins covered her mouth, trying to hold back tears. "Keanu, this is too much." Keanu shook his head. "You changed my life once," he said softly. "Now it's my turn." Mrs. Collins sat down slowly, her hands trembling slightly. She had spent so many years trying to survive, to make it through just one more day, that she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone truly care. Keanu leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "I made a few calls," he said. "There's a community program that helps people get back on their feet. Housing, job training, financial aid. They're ready to help you." Mrs. Collins swallowed hard. A part of her still struggled to believe this was real. She had grown used to empty promises, to people walking past without a second glance. But Keanu, he wasn't just passing by. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "I never imagined someone would do this for me." Keanu smiled softly. "You did this for me first," he said. "When I was just a kid in your class, you saw something in me before I ever did. Now it's my turn." Mrs. Collins felt a tear slip down her cheek. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was struggling alone. And for the first time in years, she had hope. Keanu could see the conflict in Mrs. Collins' eyes, the disbelief, the hesitation, the years of disappointment that made it hard for her to accept help. But beneath all of that, there was hope. She wiped a tear from her cheek, her voice shaky. "I don't even know where to begin. I don't know how to start over." Keanu smiled gently. "You don't have to figure it out alone." She let out a deep breath, as if releasing years of silent struggle in a single exhale. "All right, she said softly. I'll try. Keanu nodded. Good. With that, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small key. Mrs. Collins stared at it. This is for the temporary apartment I arranged for you, Keanu explained. It's already set up, clean, warm, and safe. You don't have to stay on the streets ever again. Her hands trembled as she took the key, holding it as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Tears welled in her eyes again. Keanu, He stopped her with a shake of his head. No need to say anything, he said softly. Just promise me one thing. Mrs. Collins looked at him, waiting. When you're back on your feet, Keanu said, help someone else the way I'm helping you. She let out a small laugh through her tears. That, she whispered, I can promise. And with that, her new journey began. Mrs. Collins clutched the key tightly as if afraid it might disappear. For so long, she had lived in uncertainty, never knowing where she would sleep next or when she would eat again. But now she had a second chance. Keanu stood up and pulled out his phone. I'll have a car take you to the apartment, he said. You'll have time to settle in, and then tomorrow we'll go meet with the program coordinators. Mrs. Collins stared at him, overwhelmed. You keep saying we, she murmured. Keanu smiled. Because you're not doing this alone. Tears filled her eyes again, but this time they weren't from pain or hopelessness. They were from gratitude. As they stepped outside, a light breeze rolled through the streets, rustling the leaves on the pavement. The city around them continued on, cars driving past, people walking by, unaware of the life-changing moment happening right there. A black car pulled up, and Keanu opened the door for her. Go get some rest, he said. Tomorrow's a new day. Mrs. Collins hesitated for just a moment. Then, with a deep breath, she stepped into the car. For the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving, she was starting over. The car pulled away, carrying Mrs. Collins toward a future she never thought possible. Keanu watched as the taillights disappeared into the distance, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. A weight had lifted from his chest. She had given him so much when he was younger. Her time, her wisdom, her belief in his potential. Now, he had finally given something back, and he knew this wasn't the end. Over the next few months, Mrs. Collins' life changed completely. She moved into her new apartment, a warm and safe space where she could finally rest without fear. With Keanu's help, she enrolled in a program for seniors re-entering the workforce, and soon after, she began teaching again, this time at a local community center. The local news picked up the story, and people from all over reached out to help. And just as she had promised Keanu that night, she paid it forward. She started mentoring young students again, teaching them the same lessons she had once taught him. And Keanu, he never sought attention for what he did. He never told the world about it, because for him, this wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about doing what was right, and that was enough. This story reminds us that one act of kindness can change a life. Have you ever experienced or witnessed a moment where someone's help made all the difference? Share your story in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring content.